The bulldozers arrived at 7 a.m., 3 hours before Richard Hale himself was scheduled to sign the papers that would erase St. Mary's Orphanage from the map forever. By the time his black car rolled up, 12 children were already lined up behind the rusted iron gate, watching the machines that were about to flatten the only home most of them had ever known. What none of them knew, not even Richard, was that in the next 4 minutes, one photograph was going to unravel a secret he had buried for 30 years. Richard stepped out in a suit that cost more than the orphanage's entire monthly budget. He didn't look at the children. He looked at his watch. He had a board meeting in 90 minutes, and this was supposed to be a 5-minute formality. Smile for a photo. Sign the sale. Let the demolition crew do the rest. "Mr. Hale," the director said, hurrying toward him with a folder clutched to her chest. "Before you sign, the children wanted to give you something. Please, just 2 minutes." Richard almost said no. He had said no to 100 things that morning already. But there was something about the way the smallest girl in line was staring at him, not with fear, not with anger, but like she already knew something he didn't. That should have been his first warning. Her name was Ivy. 7 years old. Shoes 2 sizes too big. A dress mended so many times the patches outnumbered the original fabric. She stepped forward from the group, holding something flat and folded against her chest like it was made of glass. "What is that?" Richard asked, more out of impatience than curiosity. "I found it under my floor," Ivy said. "I think it's supposed to be yours." He almost laughed. A 7-year-old handing a billionaire a piece of paper she found under a floorboard. His lawyer actually did laugh, quietly, behind him, but Richard took it anyway, just to move things along. And the second he unfolded it, the laughter behind him stopped mattering because his own hands had started to shake. It was a photograph. Old, cracked at the corners, the color faded to almost nothing. 2 children stood in front of this exact gate, this exact orphanage, decades before it had ever needed a demolition crew. A boy, maybe 10 years old. A woman kneeling beside him, holding his hand so tightly it looked like she was afraid to let go. Richard knew that boy's face. He'd shaved it every morning for 30 years. "Where?" he said slowly. "Did you find this?" "Under the floorboard in my room," Ivy repeated. "There was a whole box, letters too, but I can't read the old writing. The lady in the picture has your eyes." Richard's lawyer stepped forward, tapping the folder in his hands. "Richard, we really do need to keep moving. The demolition crew is on the clock." "Not now," Richard said, and something in his voice made the lawyer actually step back. Because Richard wasn't in that driveway anymore. He was 6 years old again, standing at this exact gate, in the freezing cold, watching his mother's coat disappear down the street. She had knelt down first, just like the woman in the photo, and told him it was only for a little while, just until she got back on her feet, just until she found steady work. She'd promised she was coming back for him before the leaves changed color. The leaves changed color 4 times before anyone told him she wasn't coming back at all. Nobody explained why. Nobody had the paperwork. He learned only decades later, buried in an old county record, that she had died 3 weeks after leaving him at that gate. And by the time anyone tried to notify the orphanage, the paperwork trail had gone cold, and an 8-year-old boy had already been marked unclaimed. He built an empire out of that word. Unclaimed. He swore he would never again be the kid nobody came back for. And somewhere along the way, in boardrooms and skyscrapers, he had convinced himself he didn't need to remember any of it, until a 7-year-old girl in oversized shoes just handed it back to him. "Sir?" Ivy said softly, noticing his eyes had gone glassy. "Are you okay?" Richard knelt down. The first time in years he had lowered himself to another person's level instead of making them look up at him. "Ivy, this woman in the photo. I think she might be my mother." Ivy's eyes went wide. "So this used to be your house too?" "Every day since I was 6 years old," he said. And for the first time, his voice cracked in front of a stranger. Behind him, his lawyer cleared his throat again, holding out the demolition contract, pen already uncapped. Mr. Hale, the board is waiting on the signature. We have a schedule. Richard stood up. He looked at the contract. He looked at the bulldozers. He looked at 12 children standing behind a gate identical to the one he had once stood behind, waiting for someone who never came. Then he took the pen from his lawyer's hand and tore the contract clean in half. Mr. Hale, you cannot be serious. The acquisition committee already— Cancel it, Richard said. All of it. Call off the crew. The lawyer stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe, in the way that mattered, he finally had. Lost the version of himself that had spent 30 years pretending none of this ever happened. Richard turned to the director, who looked just as stunned as everyone else in the driveway. This building isn't being demolished. It's being expanded. New dormitory wing, a real kitchen, a library, tutors, whatever these kids need. Funded, starting today. Mr. Hale, I don't understand. 20 minutes ago, you were going to— 20 minutes ago, I didn't know this was the place that made me who I am, he said. I do now. He turned back to Ivy, who was still holding the empty space where the photograph had been, watching him with the kind of cautious hope only a child who'd been let down before could understand. Ivy, I need to ask you something important, Richard said, crouching back down to her eye level. How would you feel about a family, not just a bigger building, an actual home? Mine, if you'll have it. For a moment, she didn't answer. She just stared at him like she was waiting for the catch, the way every promise in her life so far had come with one. You mean it? She finally whispered. You're not just saying it because you feel bad? I'm saying it, Richard said, because 30 years ago, somebody should have come back for the boy standing where you're standing. I can't go back and fix that, but I can make sure it never happens to you. That was the moment Ivy finally let herself cry, not from sadness, but from the strange, overwhelming relief of being chosen. Word of what happened at St. Mary's spread through the city within days, then across the country within weeks. Not the story of a billionaire who almost demolished an orphanage, but the story of a boy nobody came back for, who grew up to make sure somebody always would. Within a year, the building had a new name, the Hale House for Children. Not a monument to loss anymore, a promise finally kept. 30 years late, but not one day too late for the children who needed it now. Some promises get broken beyond repair, but every once in a while, life hands you a torn photograph, a small hand, and one last chance to keep the promise somebody else couldn't.